The cliche, takes a village to raise a child, was never more apt than the treatment of ASD. As many of you know, as caregivers, extended family, teachers, or multidisciplinary professionals in the community, you are part of the support structure, as is the applied behavioral analyst. Today, on this Autism Ontario webinar, we will be discussing Everyday ABA with Leslie Cohen. My name is Matthew Lay, and I will be your host for today's discussion. In the discussion, we hope to introduce an overview of the basic behavioral toolbox. Now, this is an introduction, and later on, Leslie is going to be touring Ontario starting in September in Sudbury, doing a series of follow-up face-to-face sessions that will drive in more detail what we discussed today. We're also going to provide you, our participants, the opportunity to ask questions directly to us. And as always, we want your feedback, we want your questions throughout the session. And by the time we complete this session, you should be more familiar with behavioral problem-solving strategies. That's if I do my job and get the right answers from Leslie, of course. Now, before we get into all of that, I want to take you through a little housekeeping items. You're seeing the video, and beside me, you're going to have a PowerPoint slide deck that will change throughout the presentation, providing some additional information about the topics that we are discussing. Below the video, there's an Ask a Question box. That's where you can submit your questions and comments at any time. They'll come to me on my iPad, and I will aspire to get you the answers to your questions. There's a resource section which contains the English and French PowerPoint presentation for you to download and review, but it also has a myriad actually, of other topical resources that will help support some of the things that we discussed today. I'll reference it throughout the presentation, but you can feel free to go ahead and browse them at your own discretion. And finally, there's the Help button. That's where if you have any issues with the technology, click on that, and a member of the support team will be there to assist you. Now that I got that out of the way, let's get started. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Autism Ontario desk, Leslie Cohen. Leslie's been working with children and adults diagnosed with ASD for the past 16 years in both Canada and the United States. She specializes in helping folks just like you, caregivers, effectively support people with ASD through creative, positive, science-based interventions. She's a licensed psychologist in the state of New York and a board-certified behavior analyst at the PhD level. Leslie, thanks for making the trip and being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, when we start these, we always want to start with a fairly broad question. And so where I want to start is, where do you generally encounter a patient or a child with ASD for the first time? When do parents or healthcare professionals usually reach out?
Well, you can see from the slide, it says we've got a crisis on your hands for those of you who are looking at it. And sadly, I often get called when there's a very big problem. Okay. So things have broken down and a child is having a meltdown or a series of meltdowns, or problems have gotten really big, or they're engaging in a dangerous behavior or hurting themselves. And the truth is, we know from the literature and we know from the data that we collect that behavior analysis can be extremely effective very, very early on in a child's life. We can make it fun, we can make it playful, we can make it work for very young children. And when we would like to get the call is when a parent first gets the diagnosis. We'd like to be called when the pediatrician says, I'm worried, or something came up on the checklist, or we're giving a diagnosis. But when we usually get the call, a parent saying, my kid is keeping me up every day, they're not sleeping, I need you now, or my kid is, they won't leave the house, or they're refusing to go to school. And so I have some of those things listed here on the slide.
It can't be an easy job if this is when you're getting the call, right?
But the good news is, of all of the people who are out there, right, a lot of times people go, wow, there's a behavior, you better get a behavior analyst. And they're sort of running away from behavior because it makes people nervous. The behavior analysts see behavior as communicative. So we're saying, you know what, when there's a behavior, I want you to call me. So I don't want to say to parents, because you've come to this moment of crisis or there's something really big, I won't help you. I'm just saying I'd love to be able to get in and help sooner.
Right, right. So beyond the clinical evidence, which I know we're going to talk a lot about how ABA can help, in your eyes, why behavioral analysis? Why is it good for children with ASD?
Well, when you ask a behavior analyst, they're going to say behavior analysis is good for everybody.
Yes.
And so it's good for typical kids. We have a lot of things that help everybody. They even help all of us, like we're all using behavioral procedures all the time. Like you did a warm-up with me before. That's actually part of antecedent intervention, which we're going to talk about later on. And it was to help lower my anxiety, and you did a really good job.
Well, thank you.
Of course, we like to claim everything that works, but that's like any field. Yeah. But what I'm saying is that little things like if you want us to recycle, you'll put the bin close to me so I can see it and I can do it. Right. These all partake of behavior analytic techniques, so we would say they're good for everybody. I think in particular for children with autism, it's been so important because there was a time in the history of autism when people thought people diagnosed with autism couldn't learn and couldn't develop and had no future. Right. And as people have developed more and more effective techniques, and as they've come to understand autism spectrum disorders better, and they've developed data, and Lovas was one of the key people when he published his first studies. The first one came out in 1987, and then the long-term follow-up in 1993. In the high-functioning group of young children with whom he worked, he was able to demonstrate a 15-point increase in their IQ. Wow. And so that really made people sit up and take notice and say, well, what is this behavioral stuff that he was doing with these kids? Right. So, and for your average parent, a lot of times people think, well, behavior analysis, I'm going to do that instead of going to the speech and language pathologist, or instead of going to a psychopharmacologist because my kid needs some medication, or instead of going to an occupational therapist, or instead of going to a PT. And I would say, no, we want to do it with. We want to do it with you. We want to do it with the team. We want to do it with the teachers in the school, with the paraprofessionals, and we can somehow amplify and augment the things that all of those other professions on the multidisciplinary team are trying to do with the kids. So on the slide you see, well, if your child has a fever, I'm not going to say take them to a behavior analyst. Right. But if your child refuses to go to the doctor, I'm going to say, hey, we've got this thing in our package. It's called systematic desensitization. And
big word.
Yes, it is big. Sometimes I can't even say it right. And we have many more. So, but what it really comes down to is I'm going to say, well, before your kid ever gets sick, or even if they've gotten sick and it didn't work so well, we can put this in where we gradually let them look at photographs of everything that happens on a visit. And while they're looking at these photographs, we can give them rewards that make it feel good to look at those photographs and know what's going to happen, but also something positive will happen. We can let them visit the doctor and get a lollipop there, or just play around for a little while in the doctor's office so that doesn't feel like an unfamiliar space. And we can work them up to the point where their anxiety is lowered about the visit and they develop the habit of going to the doctor when they're very young. Right. So when it's a necessity, you're not faced both with a sick child and a whole behavior instruction component at the same time. So that's why we say that. When we come to the second example, we would say, well, if your child has a speech delay, would I say go to a behavior analyst instead of a speech and language pathologist? Personally, I wouldn't. I think speech-language pathologists have had a huge amount to say in the development of communication and speech in children with ASD and children with any language problem. Right. But what if the child refuses to participate in the sessions with the speech and language pathologist? What if they're not available to the learning? Could we help motivate them to get the most out of that session? And if we had to give them more intensity than a person could afford to have with that speech-language pathologist, could we embed it in a system where they're getting practice trials with their family, et cetera, to support that learning? Yes, we could. Right. And the last one is, if you find a good school and your child's classmates are interested in playing with them, but they give up when your child ignores them, here we're talking about the child themselves. Is there some repertoire that we could teach your child that would allow them to hook on to that interest that their classmates are showing and not lose that opportunity to play and to have fun with their peers?
I guess it goes back to what you said earlier, too, about how valuable it can be when you're involved early on, because, troubleshooting all this stuff after the fact, that each one of these situations is happening in a different place, right? We're talking about the doctor's office, school, or with a speech therapist. We did our pre-discussion, as you said. I reviewed the slides, and I saw this very existential, philosophical question: why people do what they do. And Leslie is going to answer that. But in all reality, this is a big question that you ask, right? When dealing with a child. Talk to me a little bit about how you come to this answer.
You might not like my answer better than Plato's, but behavior analysis wants us to look at that question in a particular way. And so one of the reasons I'm here today is to familiarize everybody with even just the idea of putting on the behavioral lens. You might not want to be a behavior analyst with your child all the time.
Right.
Just like I have a family too, and I have pets, and I'm probably the worst behavioral pet owner in the world. My dog manages all of my behavior and gets me to feed him steak all the time. And I don't want to put on that lens all the time. But if I have a problem, that is the first lens I turn to. If I have a problem in the human sphere, I turn to the behavioral lens. And so when behavior analysis won't tell us everything about why people do what they do, they won't tell us about why people might do it for spiritual reasons or family reasons or emotional reasons, but what it will lead to is effective problem solving. And the behavioral lens is about asking the question, why do people do what they do, so that we can come up with an answer that leads to them living a better life. That's what we're trying to do. And so here's some examples on the slide that parents and the participants may be seeing, that we say things in this way all the time, and it doesn't mean these statements aren't true.
Yeah.
But when we put on our behavioral lens, we're saying, is that going to lead to effective learning for the child and more adaptive behavior in their community, and then being able to have more positive interactions with their family? So here's some of the things. If I say, well, he always does that when he watches TV, that's a thing we call circular.
Okay.
I might observe a kid, maybe they're hitting the table when they're watching TV, and if I then say, yeah, he does that when he watches TV, the parent will turn to me and say, I know, that's why I called you, because he's doing that when he watches TV. It doesn't lead to anything, it just re-describes the problem.
Yeah.
So we've re-described it.
Yeah, I was at the beach with my son this past weekend, and by the end of the day, he was very emotional, and he was very tired, I thought, and he was crying a little bit. And so I was saying to him, you know, Jack, you're just tired. You're overtired. Don't worry, everyone, you're overtired. So I was like labeling what he was, but clearly not doing anything to help.
And I'm guessing, as a behavior analyst, that your son, being very tired, probably said to you, I'm not tired.
Oh, yes, he yelled that a couple times when I told him that's why he was crying. He said, no, he was something else, but yeah, definitely not tired.
Right. I love the example that you give, because it's so common with everybody, with typical kids, with adults, that we all get tired. And it doesn't mean that being tired isn't true. It's the question is, if I were going to help you as a behavior analyst with your son, telling him that he's tired at age 6 when he's already overmatched, what is that going to lead to? It may actually lead to an escalation. Right. And that's the worry, right? So what would I do instead? Most of the time, with a typical kid, we always talk about good enough parenting, and in your case, it's all going to come out in the wash. He'll have another good day, have another good night, and you might not have to do anything at all. And even if you labeled his behavior, so what? But if you have a kid who has autism, and they perennially have hundreds and hundreds of failures, we try to fix almost every single one. So the techniques that would work for a typical kid if you did them, but it might not be so critical that you do them, I would say, hey, you know what? I'm looking at the data here, and it looks like every day at 4 o'clock, especially in the summer when it's hot out, he's cooked after about 45 minutes at the beach. Is there some way? I wouldn't be telling you, oh, your family drove 8 hours to the beach, and now I want you to spend only 45 minutes there, and then I want you to take him home because your kid's tired. Yeah. I would look at the environment and say, where can we find these cool, sheltering, quiet, calm moments so he can refresh himself? Do we have to go for a little ride in the car with the air conditioning on and some of his favorite music and get a cold drink into him? Is there something we can do where we can give him this moment to refresh, and then maybe he can go back to the beach for another 2 hours or whatever? And we would try to analyze the situation, what's possible to do, what the environment permits, and what's going to affect that pattern of upset. Now, if he were doing it for attention, just because he wanted to get a rise out of you, which I think is very unlikely in this case, just the way you describe it, but I would look and say, maybe that's the function. Right. We would try to change your behavior towards him. We would try to have you shower attention with him, on him, when he's doing things that are more adaptive. Like maybe when he says, Dad, I really need a break, I'm hot. Then you might give him a piggyback ride all the way to the car and just give him a lot of alone attention because he asked you instead of having a meltdown.
Exactly. So I guess the key here is, you know, if you're looking at the slide and you're seeing that these are things that maybe we've done or whatever.
Or we say
aloud, it's okay. It is generally a general reaction that most people have. I got a question from the audience. I'm going to ask you to put on the behavioral lens real quick and not give the answer. But when you look at a question like, you know, my child's having troubles making friends and keeping friends for that matter, how can I help them? So putting the behavioral lens onto that problem, what is the first thing that you look at?
Well, I would probably go see the child in their milieu and see where are things breaking down, like what are the other kids doing that they think is fun that my child isn't doing, and that could be very different for different kids.
Right.
So the first thing I would do is look and see what friendship skills does the child have. Another thing I would look at is I would say, well, what's their frustration and delay tolerance? Do they have some of these things where they can even wait for another kid to have a turn? Let's say they have all of that. Let's just pretend, because we have to start somewhere, so we have to pretend a little bit. Let's say they've got some pretty good waiting skills, they've got some pretty good play skills, but things break down because when the other kid starts a new thing, they're frightened of it, they're not really ready for that new thing, they don't know how to do it, and then they just walk away from their friend or go, no, I don't want to do that, and then the friend is put off. Let's just pretend that's the scenario. I might recommend structured play dates with kids of a variety of ages where we can practice some of the skills right before the kid comes over, and then we reward the kid for engaging in all of the proper behaviors and give them a warm-up like you gave me, where they get to practice some of the things right before the kid gets there, or from a videotape, some of the things that the friend might do, and practice and reward those skills, build them up. And so instead of having fewer opportunities to play with kids, I would increase them, but I would limit their length of time, structure them, give practice before with rewards, and so that the kid could actually have some success. And then I would probably not let them go on to the point where the kid's having failures. I would increase the length of that play date very gradually.
Okay.
So,
just a question, because it is a structured play date. Would you work with the other child as well and let them know these things may happen if the other child...
It depends on, that is a situation that very much depends on how private the parents are about the kid's diagnosis and how skilled the kid is. However, I do try to make these things as natural as possible. So a lot of times, like, a parent's kind of hanging out, but I coach the parent in what to do so they don't have to have a therapist on the play date.
Right.
And so we try to have things look very structured, and the parent has an idea in their mind about what's their go-to thing if this play activity isn't working.
Right.
But the kids don't see something that looks therapeutic. And so a lot of times kids, depending on their age, they don't really care if a kid does something that's a little bit unusual, that wasn't expected. What they really care about is that they have a good time at the play date, that the parents and the kid were nice to them, and that there was fun stuff to do, and that they enjoyed themselves.
Right.
So we want to ensure that that's happening as and then if I'm coaching a kid, I use really casual language like, oh, I think he didn't hear you. A lot of parents are really good at this. Could you say that a little louder? Or, I don't think he saw you. Could you come sit over here? And I'm not saying anything that's really necessarily therapeutic.
Right.
In style.
Let's go back to answering the very philosophical question. Why people do what they do in the behavioral lens.
You know what? It's really funny because usually people ask this question in philosophy classes, and I don't think we ever really answer it.
Yeah.
So I think it's only fair that I try to answer it, because behavior analysis really does have an answer. It might not be a satisfying answer because it's the question of what is the meaning of life.
Yes.
And so a lot of people from a philosophical point of view might find the behavioral answer unsatisfying because it isn't going to answer that. But what it will do is give an answer of why people do what they do from the perspective of problem solving. How can we solve problems that prevent people from enjoying a meaningful life, a satisfying life, having friendships, and just living well? And so these are the reasons why, from a behavioral point of view, people do what they do. To avoid aversive situations, to get away from stuff that's hurts or painful or noxious, to access stuff we want and need. We all want that.
Yeah.
Because it has worked in the past, so I'll do anything. Like, why do I put my keys in the car in the morning? Because yesterday when I did do that, I was able to turn my car on and it worked. If my battery is dead, it won't work today, but I'll be relying on the history.
Yes.
And habits, we develop a habit because it feels good to do it. So that even could be some of the things like some of the self-stimulating behaviors or repetitive behaviors that kids have. We don't want them to do it, but it actually feels good to do it. So that's what parents ask me, why are they doing that? Well, it does feel good.
Right.
And then the last thing is they got the signal. And I think a huge amount of behavior analysis is wrapped up in this one little part. And we have a complicated word we like to use. It's called stimulus control. Like you don't drive your car through a red light. You wait for a green light. The green light tells you that going is a good thing to do. It's going to lead to good outcomes. And a red light tells you that going is not going to lead to those good outcomes. It's going to lead to a ticket and a dent in your nice car.
Right.
I hope you have a nice car if you're driving all the way from Hamilton. So stimulus control gives people, we get signals from the environment all the time about what we're about to do. We're about to have a conversation. Your face is signaling that you're leaning towards me. I'm getting a lot of signals about our conversation. And so sometimes you can stop a behavior by getting it under the control of a signal and then getting rid of that signal, or only giving that signal in situations where that behavior really works.
So not to reduce your whole what you do to one slide, but basically what we're looking at here is we see a behavior, whether it's a problem, generally speaking, a problem behavior, something that we're trying to alter, and the lens is to look at all of these elements to try and ascertain what's driving that behavior.
That's correct.
Okay. So I want to start. This slide is called Understanding Your Behavioral Analyst. And one thing that I heard in doing some research leading up to this is that some parents and caregivers struggle with understanding their behavioral analyst. Maybe some of the approaches, a lot of the talk about data, and some of those big words we've always heard. So it may be a misunderstood profession in some ways. Can you talk about why that is and help us understand you a bit?
Yes. And in fact, I was trying to sort of prepare parents because I think behavior analysts can do a lot of good, but I think we can be off-putting as well, not meaning to be, but I want to try and help understand when we're putting on the behavioral lens all the time, it can be a little bit intense. So one of the things I think is that we talk funny, and parents sometimes say to me, well, I had to learn a whole new language just to understand my behavior analyst.
Right.
And I would say, we're developing as a field, and clinicians are getting better at using the precise terms that they need to, but also being able to translate those into everyday language that everybody can understand. So I'm thinking that problem is starting to resolve a bit in our field. But why does your behavior analyst want to use all of those terms? One of the things are that some of the other terms people use put a lot of heat into situations. Like if I say, that kid is a bully.
Right.
I'm looking at that kid forever after, and we actually have data on that. If you call someone a bad name and you characterize them that way, your behavior towards that person does change, and not for the better for that person. So if I say that person is getting X and X reward for that behavior, right? I'm really not talking about the person, whether they're good or bad. I'm just saying that behavior is being increased because it's being rewarded. So if we can change the situation, we can get that behavior to go down. So they like to be very precise, and sometimes that precision drives them to use these terms so that we won't be confused about what we're looking at or what we're talking about. Another thing I think is a lot of parents say to me like, well, I want my kid to do it because they know it's right. I don't want them to do it for rewards. I want them to do it because they know it's right, and we have those values. And I think that's, couldn't be more true than in a place like Canada where people have such amazing values, like heroic values of helping others, a tradition of charitable work and helping people. That's part of the Canadian culture. And so it isn't surprising that if I say, well, your kid does love you, and they do want to do good things, but their little body doesn't work so well, so I'm going to have to give them a few more breadcrumbs on the way to get them to do those things you want them to do, and that might be giving them more rewards or more bigger reaction when they do something for a really long time. It isn't going to feel as natural. But it doesn't mean your kid doesn't love you and that they're only doing it for a cookie or for a high five or something like that.
Is the fear though that, we go back to habits, right?
Yes.
Is the fear that they get a cookie when they give me a hug, that they're going to associate hugging me with a cookie and not loving me?
What I would say is that there are problems with reinforcement too. Reinforcement is incredibly powerful, so cookies are very powerful. And I do think it's the job of good behavior analysts to try to find these motivators that fit the situation, and really crafty ones do, because sometimes kids really do like a hug, but maybe that kid's really sensitive and the hug is too hard. And so they get frightened by the restraint, and they're more sensitive than another kid, so the hug actually is a little bit aversive to them. So maybe we can change the topography of the hug, and we don't have to use a cookie in that situation. So we have to think craftily about these things too, because anything you add, later you have to remove. We can't have a kid walking around with a giant bag of cookies hugging people. You know, that's not going to work.
So you keep hearing the words reward, reward, reward. Is it all about reward in ABA now, or does the stick come into play at all?
Well, the stick is there in our world, so I find I often don't have to add it. So my philosophical stance, a lot of times parents or teachers or anybody I'm working with will tell me, like, you know, well, we have to start. Even people who aren't dealing with kids with special needs, people say to me something like, well, it's a big, mean world out there, so we have to be mean to our kid now so they're used to it. And I'll say, no, we don't, because the world will take care of that. So I don't have to have my kid thinking I was mean to them on purpose when there was no reason for it. I do have to keep my kids safe, and I often say to parents, like, you know, if a kid's starting to walk out into a busy street, will I tackle that kid? You bet. Is that going to be aversive to that kid? Does that kid want to be tackled? No, they do not.
No, for sure.
But that's a fairly rare situation. And so a lot of times I find when the stick comes out, in practice among non-behavior analysts, it happens much more than in actually people who are using behavior analysis, because we know how to reward. So we don't have to have a stick as much. But another thing that happens is a lot of times the stick comes out because we want to change a behavior really fast. And if we took our time, we could use less aversive methods and get the same result. And that's what Murray Sidman was often talking about, this idea that we rush, and there are problems with that. Like if a parent, like if you hit me, let's say you hit me to stop me from blobbing because you want to turn to talk.
Which I often do want another turn to talk.
And it worked. Look, you got a turn. But the problem with that is that tomorrow, when I'm going on and on and on again, you're going to have to hit me a little harder because of this effect that is well known in research called habituation. Most parents don't know about that. So when they say, oh, I'm not going to do any of this rewarding stuff, it takes so much time and blah, 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 because I spanked him and it worked. But then that same parent 6 months down the road, they've gotten into a situation where their kid's afraid of them and they're hitting them harder and harder, and they're not even realizing it because it got habituated, and they said, well, now I have to hit him a little harder, or now I have to hold him down on his chair, and that works really well. And gradually, the habituation is ramping up until the point where we're actually injuring a child. And so there are some things that are a little bit risky there, that the stick it can be. And I'm not saying I wouldn't give a kid natural consequences, like, you know, if you go outside and you get wet, you will remember to take an umbrella the next time
it's raining.
Even if you're forgetful like me, a few times is enough. So I'm not saying that consequences aren't aversive for people, they are, but we don't often need as many of them as we sometimes reach for if we know a lot about how to reward appropriately and how to fade rewards.
Well, for those of you who may be non-believers or those who like data, in the resource section you'll find some great resources that are about some of the studies that we are referencing. There's the website for Vogel is there, as well as Kegel, I think.
The Kegels, I love their pivotal response training website, and Lovas has great data. Those studies are there, and there's a few more as well.
So a lot of stuff we're talking about. You can go there and check it out on your own. I want to remind everyone we are collecting questions, taking comments throughout the presentation. We have one here that we're going to move to right now, but please submit them as we go because we are here to help get you some answers today. Before we move on, someone's looking for some strategies to help broaden their child's interests and hobbies. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Sure. One of the things that's true is that a lot of times when kids don't show an interest in something, it's because they're there's a fluid skill needs to be in place in order for it to be enjoyable. Let's take things like miniature golf or riding a bike. We know that once they're good at it, it will be enjoyable, but the steps might be aversive because they see all these other kids who are already fluid and already able to do it, and they're not able to, and they're not accessing the good parts like riding really fast or having the wind blowing in your hair. That comes later after you're really good at it. So by breaking things up and doing a task analysis, we can start to reward the little steps or make the little steps easier so that they have this opportunity to practice and become fluid at it. And once they're fluid at it, the interest actually is there. Bike riding is a really good example. You know, you've got these groups here that are really great at it, like Pedal Heads, I think it's called. I hope I'm getting their name right. But they are doing task analysis and breaking things down so that kids are really successful. Sometimes we change the bike. Yeah. A kid will be on a much more stable bike for a while so they can experience the good parts of it. Or when I start to teach them, they're on a little downhill slope so that if their feet aren't very strong, they're still getting some speed. And so we have this way of making things work and breaking things down and rewarding the steps so that an interest can develop. Another way to develop interest is through plain old Pavlovian conditioning, another big word that we like to throw around in behavior analysis. And what that means is if a new activity is paired with all the stuff you already love, isn't that great? Yeah. So, for example, for your child, just being with dad is going to be so hugely motivated that almost anything you're interested in doing, they are going to want to do. If they get to be alone with you and they don't have to share you with their siblings or anybody else, we have this huge amount of reinforcement. And I even laugh sometimes. This could get me in trouble with a lot of people, but there was a show recently on Canada, in Canada. It was on CBC, I think, and it was this little girl, I believe, from Quebec, who was swimming with the dolphins. And I know behavior analysts just see red when they see this whole dolphin therapy as opposed to behavior analysis, so it's a very dangerous thing to bring up. But what I loved about that show was that the person therapist who worked with her and the dolphin actually said this wonderful thing, and he said, I found a real motivator for this kid. I found something she really likes. So it wasn't something magical about the dolphin. In the mind of the dolphin professional thought he'd finally found something that she wanted so much that he could use it to reward all of the behaviors like speech that he was trying to get. Right.
For my son, it was Star Wars. So when you're looking at a child with ASD or anyone that you're working with, what do you care about? What are the things that you care about?
Well, behavior analysts in general, we really care about the form of a behavior, and that can be really strange to people, but we have another fancy word we'd like to use called the topography. Okay. And we can spend a lot of time trying to make sure everybody agrees about what is the actual look of this behavior. What does it look like? What does it sound like? When does it happen? And the reason we like to have agreement is because a lot of times kids end up getting punished for things because someone said a word like, that kid is obnoxious in class, or that kid is interrupting me too many times. And when we look at what was really disturbing the teacher or the parent or their peer or their sibling, we got the wrong topography. So in the case of a kid in the classroom, if we took data on it and we found, well, that kid only interrupts about once every 3 days, and if I look at all the other kids in the class, they're interrupting at about the same rate, but he does have a teacher who's very sensitive to being interrupted and gets rather flustered when they're interrupted, which people are all different. Yeah. And also, when this kid interrupts, he yells out in a disrespectful way, "Hey, you!" And he doesn't say, "Hey, Ms. Cohen," and he doesn't have a polite thing. If we separate those topographies, if we can teach the one of addressing the teacher politely or raising the hand or waiting a little bit for a response, and find the actual topography, when data collection shows us that actually the interruptions were not at a very high rate. And it leads to kids getting more positive rewards and less punishment because we're fixing the actual problem instead of, if I say a kid is screaming, a parent might say, oh, okay, this kid is screaming, but if I find they're screaming because they're hurt or because they're sick, I'm not going to fix that topography. Right. So that's why we really care about that.
And you need data to do that.
Yes, we do. We need data. We care about the function, what holds the behavior in place, because that gives us our big access for getting rid of problem behaviors. So if I'm a little kid and I was a terribly manipulative kid, which is probably why I grew up to be what I am today, a psychologist. For example, my parents, who were very loving and very tender-hearted people, I don't know how they got somebody like me, but what would happen is I would do something naughty. Like one time I even did something dangerous. I know I was like 5 and I put a cat on my head. And they thought the cat was going to just scratch my eyes to bits. And they yelled at me. And then they felt terribly guilty. So after they screamed at me, my brothers and sisters had to go to bed at 8 o'clock, and I got to stay up at 10 at this brightly colored fountain with my mom and my dad alone, and I got to play in the colored water until 10 o'clock. And at 5, I was like, I'm going to get another cat because I could get rid of my siblings with this cat. So I worked it out unconsciously that somehow, even though my parents got very upset, it led to very rich attention, and that increased some of my bad, naughty behavior, I think.
So that what your parents did was holding the knot. That's the function, holding it in place.
Yes,
by
they
that
showered me with delicious private attention based on naughty behavior and increased it.
Frequency.
So we want to know if our intervention is working.
Right.
So we really want to know how often is a behavior actually occurring and what time of day is it really occurring, because we can have things like contrast effects, like it looks like we got rid of all, let's say I have a repetitive behavior like banging my hand on the table. You might get rid of it during the day and then find, wow, I'm doing it all night long.
Yeah.
We didn't really get rid of it.
Okay.
So we need to know that our intervention is working, and that's why we want to know when is it happening, and is the frequency going down or going up? If you want me to talk, how often am I really talking? How often am I initiating a conversation? Yeah. We need to know about the frequency. And when does the behavior occur and how long does it last? Because if a kid's having a tantrum 10 times a week, and we have a successful intervention, and they're still having a tantrum 10 times a week, that could actually be true, because maybe their tantrum lasted 12 hours and now it lasts 2 minutes.
Right.
The frequency hasn't gone down, but the intensity and the duration have reduced. That's important to know.
It is. I've got a question here which says it's going to be a difficult question before it even asks it, so we'll see how we do here.
I'm going to start hitting the table.
It is so difficult to model situations, even understand the triggers that result in emotional regulation challenges. How can ABA help with emotional regulation?
Well, let me really, I don't want to roll my eyes up in my head like a lizard when I answer that question. So what I would say is that we find when we really, even data like scatter plot data, I want to say that there are types of observation and types of data collection that actually do help us understand emotional challenges, even when the triggers are subtle and even when the triggers are a combination of factors. So I want to give an example of this. Sometimes people will tell me there's no pattern to a child's behavior because a child did not have a meltdown when they were presented with a particular challenge. Like, let's say they had to wait for a few minutes while a parent was having a conversation. And then the same thing triggered a huge meltdown at another time. And a parent will say to me, well, they had a huge outburst this time, but the other time they proved to me that they were perfectly capable of it. Sometimes when we actually start to take data and look at situations, there can be a snowball of things that happened on the day that the meltdown occurred. Like, for example, a child's in a really noisy, crowded environment, like they got taken to a soccer game, or they were in a hallway at school when all the kids were being dismissed. And the same demand was actually paired with a lot of other challenges, and that emotional behavior that seemed to come out of nowhere, actually the demands of the situation were much greater than we knew for the kid. And so if we start to look at situations, a lot of our emotional behavior does follow a pattern. And what that means is sometimes we can eliminate some of the other factors and keep the challenge. Like if I want to teach a kid to wait, I want him to teach, but I might introduce noisy environments a little more gradually in the case of this kid in the hallway who I made up, but who resembles a lot of kids that I have. So I would say with emotional behavior, it is still worth it to look at triggers and to look at situations and look at what happens after the whole emotional outburst is over, what happens to that, and what skills a child has to actually be successful and less frustrated and try to build their repertoires so they don't get as upset because they're actually successful. So a lot of times kids are having more emotional outbursts because they're having more failures. And if we can teach them skills so they have fewer failures, their frustration will also go down.
And what I hear as well, for the message for the parent there is, if at first you look, you say the same thing happened 2 times, they dealt with it this time, they showed me they could deal with it. No, you need to dig deeper to see what other triggers were in place, what other...
What was different about those two? And it could be time of day.
Yeah.
It can be very subtle things like another person was there who was a safety signal. Like one time the parent was there, one time they weren't.
Yeah.
But they have a history of knowing they're going to be safe with that parent. And they were able to tackle that challenge when their parent was there as a safety signal, but when the parent was not there, it was too much.
Look at the signals,
yeah.
Look at things like timing. Problem behavior. Or problem behaviors. This is something that we hear a lot.
Yes.
And actually we're going all the way back to the beginning of the presentation of when you normally get engaged is when there's a problem behavior.
Right.
Talk to me about how you look at problem behaviors.
Well, one of the first things is a lot of times problem behaviors are normal behaviors that are more intense, occur at the wrong time, place, or the wrong frequency. And so for me, a problem behavior is just another behavior, so I don't get emotional about it. Like when you're a parent or a teacher and you're engaged with a kid and you're dealing with that problem behavior, a lot of times your emotions get involved too, and that's normal.
Yeah.
It's normal because you're dealing with this problem behavior. But when I look at it, I'm trying to figure out, is it happening at the wrong time? Is it too intense? Is there something we could do to shift it, to move this flow of behavior and make it work better for the parent or the teacher? And a really good example of that, let's take something like screaming.
Yeah.
Well, if there's a fire in your house, like go ahead, like scream.
Yeah.
Or if somebody's hurting you, scream.
Or if you're at a hockey game.
If you're at a hockey game, right, scream. It's good, let's do it. But if you're at the breakfast table and your parent is not a morning person and you're screaming for an hour because you want your Odie flakes or whatever it is, or your most kids want Frosted Flakes or Cocoa Puffs or something like that. That's too much, and it's the wrong time, and it isn't going to work that well for the parent. It isn't going to lead to a lot of positive rewards. So in that case, I might teach the kid how to get their own Cocoa Puffs, so mom and dad could sleep a little longer if they're capable of it.
Yeah.
Or I might leave a portion of Cocoa Puffs out for them so they don't have to ask for it and cut the whole meltdown. That's antecedent intervention. Just cut to whatever the reward was so that that behavior didn't work anymore.
Okay.
Okay? So we have a lot of different things that we can do.
So it can be an access, but what else can it be?
It can be a deficit.
Okay.
And 9 times out of 10, it's better to look at things as what's missing than to look at the behavior problem, because when you have a behavior problem, a lot of people want to punish it. And it unfortunately works. It does work to punish bad behaviors. But the missing skill, if we don't teach that, there's going to always be more problem behavior. So if I need a break and I know that I can break you down, like if I just do something really obnoxious, like I start yelling at you, I can end this interview and I can go swimming or go hiking or go to a restaurant or whatever I want to do. That's going to work for me. But it would be better if I said, I need a minute. Yeah. And so if I can then say, you know what, if I can teach this kid to read this card that says I need a minute and they can immediately get escape, it's far better than for them to scream and push my buttons in order to get the same thing.
Yeah, as a parent of a child not on the spectrum, I know how hard that is anyways, right? Not having them, act out when they want to stop doing something they don't want to do or to get something that they do want in that case. Is that something that you've seen effectively work with children on the spectrum?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
But I think that you've probably been in the situation like all parents where when you're in a public situation, it's not always the best time to teach.
Yes.
Have you ever had your kid at the grocery store, suddenly they land on something and they just throw themselves down and you have all the other parents looking at you like,
judging.
How did he raise this child?
Yes.
And for parents of children with autism, I believe it's doubly hard because their child is so beautiful and looks so typical. They don't have a disorder that people can see. Like if I break my leg and I'm on a crutch or if I'm in a wheelchair, other people are going to see it's going to take me longer and they're going to make an accommodation. But if they see this beautiful child raging around the store screaming, the parents feel very pressured.
Yeah.
And yes, the techniques do work both for your child and that child to help lower that behavior.
Behavior calling. Most of the time, behavior is communicative. It is a language that can tell you about a child's needs.
Right.
So we're telling parents now to look at it that way, like when they see the behavior?
I think it can take us out of that emotional stance, even sometimes when things are really tough,
right.
and say, we want to say, what deficit was there that my kid couldn't tell me about this situation? I'll give you an example of when it's so risky. Like a lot of times we get into, I get the call when a kid has a toileting issue, and there are many times when a kid has a breakdown in their toileting procedures. So at one time, or many times I get called in and they say, well, we want to use an aversive procedure because my kid wasn't having accidents and now they're having accidents.
Right.
And sometimes I've gone into situations like that, and when I started to take data, I found out that there was something, when the kid was having an accident, a nonverbal child, somebody was actually hurting them, not the parent, but somebody the kid was encountering, and that nonverbal child had no way to say there's something wrong
right.
here. And so if we started to punish the accidents, we would not have actually found out that there was something causing the fear that caused the accidents.
Right.
And that can happen, especially in nonverbal children. Their behavior is telling us that there's a stressor in the environment sometimes, or that something's wrong with things are not working for them in the environment.
With ASD, communication can be such an issue that you got to be looking
Even
at.
verbal kids, when they're stressed, they don't always communicate. And so here's some pictures for everybody who wants to know. Like, even really huge behaviors, like huge meltdowns, really big ones, the topography of the meltdown doesn't matter. The kid with ASD may go from 0 to 10, and just because they went to 10 doesn't mean that what originally set it going wasn't something very simple that happens to typical kids all the time, like, I'm getting sick, I have to go to the bathroom, but I couldn't tell you or didn't tell you, I got tired, or I'm hungry as a bear. Even when I'm hungry as a bear, I get really nasty.
Yeah.
So these are the things that can actually create quite a bit of big behavior.
I'm going to pause right now. I've got a question here.
Okay.
My son loves TTC buses. For those of you, most people are familiar, those are that's the Toronto Transit. He talks about the buses every day. All day he wants to ride them everywhere he goes, or just ride them all the time. What do you suggest, say or do to try to divert this attention from buses?
So there's a lot there in this question, and a lot of times it depends upon the age of the child. But for some kids, especially kids who might be diagnosed even with Asperger's or high-functioning kids, sometimes these obsessive interests, if you try to put a total clamp on them, like 0 TTC, nothing, you actually get more intense behavior, and you might get kids escaping to take the TTC, which would be dangerous.
Right.
So what I find is there's a principle in behavior analysis that is very helpful, and that is this idea in behavior analysis that we call the PREMAC principle. We have a name for almost everything, but it's also this idea, like if I could just forget about the terminology and say, rewards are very powerful, but if you have to work really hard for them, the reward is less rewarding. Right. So for example, I would do almost anything for dark chocolate. I really like it, but if you told me I had to do an interview on the web in order to get a small piece of dark chocolate, I would get over it.
Right.
So without being mean to a kid, a lot of times we can use that interest, if we can't get rid of it altogether, to use it as a reward for behaviors we're trying to build. Like we're gonna talk about the TTC after we practice a phone call you might have with a normal friend, or inviting another kid over to your house,
right.
And then we will do it. Or while we're going to the TTC, sometimes we're going to learn all of these different safety rules that we're going to practice in a lot of situations, not just on the TTC. And when that high interest has been paired so much with work, it loses a little bit of its luster, and that's something that's really helpful. So that's one strategy. Another thing that we do is we try to not withdraw the thing altogether sometimes, but sometimes we try to have it in a scheduled way so kids know when they can expect it, and then they're not anxiously trying to push for a conversation. Like if I say to a kid, I'm never going to talk to you about the TTC, an anxious kid will turn to me and say, well, I saw TTC, and then they're waiting for punishment, like, is Doc going to be mad at me?
Yeah.
And then they're going to compulsively ask about it over and over and over again. Like, I've blown this, I already mentioned TTC, so I might as well just go for it.
Yeah.
If I create a schedule and I can say, look, on Mondays, we take the TTC, and on Tuesdays, it's my turn, I want to talk about this other thing, a kid knowing when that's available and knowing when it's not available sometimes we can move it around a little bit. So I'm not saying those are the solutions for this child.
Right.
I don't know how old the child is.
Yeah.
And then I might also try to add some social demands by doing things with friends. Okay.
But to start a barometer on this, if all they want to do is write a TCC all day, every day, it is a good idea to try to divert the attention somewhat, right?
I do think so. But what I think is, in terms of diverting it, you sometimes really do want to give a kid a very clear idea. This is the idea of stimulus control. When will you be able to do it?
Right.
We don't want to just say, I'm constantly putting you off, because that increases anxiety and can increase the demands for TTC. If they know when, then we can say, not now.
Okay.
And we can divert it.
I'm going to go back to the presentation. Remember, submit your questions. We are coming up on our final Q&A session of the day, so continue to submit your questions. We're talking here about behavior and when it comes out, and you got this great slide here, play in a satisfying way.
Okay, so here's some bears who really have it going on. But we're talking about behavior deficits, and we really want to look at what kids don't know how to do. So if you want to flip through these pictures for the parents, a lot of times what they don't know how to do is play in a good way. What could I do instead? And how do I deal with change or delay to my gratification or mild frustration? Do I have ways to do it? Do I have a way to predict the future? When can I talk about the TTC?
Right.
And then we have some more. Do I know how to interact positively with siblings and friends? Do I have some tools for that, some things that I can do? And do I know how to comfort myself? If we don't teach kids how to comfort themselves and we leave a parent in the position as being the one person who can calm a kid down, then when a parent really needs a break, they can't get away, because for them, for the child, that parent is my safety blanket.
Right,
I need them all the time. I can't calm down, I can't go to sleep, and then we're in trouble when it comes to independence.
Right.
Can I solve problems effectively? Do I have strategies for solving my own problems? Can I have an effect on my environment? And can I get praise and attention in a good way?
So those are the questions to ask, but is this slide another philosophical, very philosophical one? As parents sitting at home, are saying, yeah, my child may not have those skills at this stage, so what is it that we do?
So in our behavior basics, fortunately, we have a lot of things we can do.
Okay.
If we look at what happened right before the behavior, is there something, are we giving a kid a signal? Like my poor parents, do they have a guilty look on their face? And I'm going like, okay, if I jump on it now, I'm going to go to the fountain and get to stay up till 10 o'clock at night.
Right.
So I would encourage my parents not to give that look. Don't look guilty. It's bad. But another thing is that, let's say that kid that I made up, they're in that very noisy hallway, and then all of a sudden their ability to tolerate the situation and wait or do whatever we're asking them to do, transition to class, is totally destroyed. Well, in that case, I might really totally have to change it. I might say, you know what? I've got some kids who've had to do an off transition where they go to class when it's quiet. They have to be dismissed early or a few minutes late and go in the transition in the hallway when it isn't noisy, because they've proven to me that they can do that transition independently, but the noise is too much. And would I gradually introduce them to noisy situations? Yes. Right. But I might not do it in the middle of the high school day as my first move.
Right, so it's not avoiding the situation entirely, it's finding a way to deal with it in the moment.
Yes.
And then figuring out a strategy for working it back in.
And giving meltdowns a rest is like giving failure a rest. We want to have a kid not have too many failures and not have too many meltdowns as we gradually work them up to tolerating situations, because they will tolerate sooner if they're successful with little steps than fail with a step that's too big. Then we want to look at the function. What are they getting for doing that? Mm-hmm. And if they're getting something too good for doing something naughty, then make sure they don't get it for that, but they get it for something positive.
Right.
And deficits. What is a little step towards a better alternative that I can teach my kid? If it isn't the perfect thing, the end thing I would like them to do is call their friend and have a conversation with them. Well, could I have them tell me they want to have a friend over? Right. Or point to a picture of a friend? What could I give them as the next communicative step that would be better than having a meltdown? And then motivation. This is when I mentioned the Kegels before, because I think Lynn Kegel, with pivotal response training, has just done such a tremendous job, and so she's referenced in the things, and you
in
can
the resource section.
And she's on the nanny. She was on the nanny show. She's really a great behavior analyst, and in her set of tools, behavioral tools, pivotal response training, she sees motivation as the big deficit in autism. So
the deficit within those with ASD, or the deficit?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
She's saying that for them, if we can conquer motivation, we can really do something. Like we can really change things. And so, for example, I might be really motivated because I know after this talk is over, if I can just get through it without making a fool out of myself, then I can go out with my friends tonight. We're all going to go out for dinner. I'm motivated by having a conversation with my friends. If you took a 2-year-old kid and said, hey, you know what, if you just get up and walk, you're going to have a conversation with a bunch of adults at a dinner table for hours, they would say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's not just that we want to find what motivates a kid, it's that we want to develop what could motivate a kid. And that's the challenge that we're really talking about. We really want to grab that challenge.
Okay, so at this point, when you download the PowerPoint presentation, you're going to see us go really in depth into some of these. And the follow-up sessions that we talked about later on in the fall are also going to go into a lot more depth and talk about these and actually give you an opportunity to bring forward some of the issues you may be having with your children. Right now, though, I do have some more questions from the web, and we committed to getting to these, so I really want to jump into them. Any suggestions for parents trying just to describe the social difficulties your child might have if they're not a parent to a teacher or someone else that they're engaging with?
Wait, can you say that again? They're trying to describe it to a teacher?
It sounds like, yeah, their parents are trying to describe the social difficulties that their child might have because they're going to, I guess, to a teacher who maybe does not understand them, or they're not a parent in the classroom.
Oh, right. Okay, so I think that one of the things that's true are that when we describe it, we want to not get the other person's back up. Okay. So we can talk about the environment of the classroom and how our kid is doing well because we see all of these things. So we want to look closely at the classroom. A lot of times when a kid isn't having a problem in the classroom, they have an extremely structured situation. So it is not uncommon for kids with ASD to do better in a super structured classroom where they know everything that's going to happen next. So we can begin by seeing what's good and praising it. Yeah. And that's a really good starting place. Like I might go to a teacher and I go, wow, your class runs like a clock. And for my kid, that really lowers their anxiety. And you have a lot of visuals and they know what's coming next and this is what's working for them. They know the expectations. And I'll say, I want you to take a look at my kid at recess and see for yourself what I'm seeing when there isn't that structure in place or they have to manage it themselves and they can't predict what's going to happen, like when they're with a friend or in these other situations. This is what I see. And you may be able to see it even at school if you look into these types of situations because that's what's different. So I think if we start by trying to notice in the environment why they're not seeing it and praising them for it and say, we do try to add a lot of structure, but these are the situations right now that are really challenging for my kid, and really describe what they're doing. Another thing that's really helpful is to describe how your kid feels when they have a failure. Because teachers love kids, and they do not want to see them fail. So if you can really explain not just how this terrible behavior happens that annoys a bunch of adults and is really challenging, but how your kid feels when a kid turns away from them, and how they react to that, and how they go off by themselves and just sit there, or whatever the behavior is that they engage in that shows that that didn't work out for them very well. I believe that people don't want that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen.
I'm sure knowing your triggers, your signals, and those things as well, and bringing that to the teacher's attention will make things easier for them as well. Next question. My son is now 16 and he wants to find a part-time job. I'm trying to go through the small steps and find a work environment that will not be too stressful to him. Can you suggest something to help me encourage him to try? I'm worried he is feeling insecure. What can I do?
Okay. So one of the things that's been really helpful, and I don't know how, like, I don't know every parent's situation and what resources they have access to, so please forgive me if I say things that you can't do. But I've seen some very successful job coaching things done where they have a peer or a person who agrees to act in the role of peer. And for example, at the high school in the United States, and I know this organization is here as well in Canada, the Best Buddies organization, there's somebody who's going with that kid who isn't a parent, but who is also going to the same job. So if there's somebody who's like slightly older, a college student or a high school student who's very mature, who's also trying out the job with them, they're not alone in that situation. And then that social element, I would put a reward, like I would gradually increase the time they're at the job so they go for a few minutes, but we might give them an allowance that they get immediately. Like one of my kids, one of the kids that I worked with, he got a job at a place like Walmart or Staples, and he really wanted one of the candies that they sell there, and so he got to buy one every day, and he just had to work a short time. He didn't have, you know, a lot of, you know, that I don't know what the skill level of the kid is who's trying to try out a job, but even for him, by placing something really rewarding in that environment and placing something rewarding at the end of it and keeping the time short at first and gradually building it, we got it. But for many kids, I find the idea of having a posse really lowers their anxiety. So one kid who's doing it with them, and the Kegel's model of peer coaching is very helpful. They're also available on their website, where the peers at this age, they really do get coached.
Okay.
So that can be helpful.
Not being sure about resources, there are links to a number of resources, Abacus for ABA, Spiral for all professionals that help work with ASD, so you may be able to find stuff in our resource section. We have tons of questions. We're running out of time. I'm going to push the envelope a little bit and go just a little bit here and try and get this next question answered. And I'm going to send a message to the producers in the back if he wants to go a couple minutes over. I don't think that is an issue at all. But how do you work with kids who think extremes and frequently use words like never or always? For example, I will never ride a bike, or you never let me do anything.
Right. So one of the things I would say is that a lot of times these very, very strong statements and these negative refusals, even though parents certainly see situations where once a kid has refused something, they hold that rule, so very rule-governed behavior. But a lot of times these statements, just like scripting out of movies, like I worked with a kid who, when he was about to hit me, he would say, Doc Antoine must go to jail. It was from one of his movies that he saw. And it was his way of telling me, I'm sick of these bloody demands. I've had it. I've had enough. I've had enough. And so that was really helpful for me because I didn't get hit, so we could go to a more chill activity for a little while and then come back at our demands. But what I'm saying is I think sometimes the surface of the statement might be saying something else, and it's good to know the function of that. Are they trying to back off demands? Are they anxious? And so a lot of times for some kids, humor and a gradual introduction, like I'm just going to give one example from my own recent clinical history. There was a lovely teenage girl, who got stuck in school because she was a very advanced artist and loved to draw Pixar and Disney characters and was really quite good at it. And what happened was there was a new one that she wanted to draw, and the paraprofessional came to me and said she's refusing to do it in her art class, Doc. She's refusing to draw this character because she's afraid if she draws it, it won't be perfect. And she said, no, I will never draw this character. And she got very, very upset. And so she was stuck for several days before they came to me, and they said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, I've got a great idea. Let's go to the art teacher. So I made the kid advocate for herself for tracing paper, and let's trace the new character so it can be sort of perfect, and then you can make your painting. And the first thing the kid said to me was, I am not going to trace the paper. So this story doesn't end there with me finding the magic of tracing paper, because my picture is not going to be a tracing. I'm going to do it myself. I'm not going to copy. And I said, when I was lucky, I changed the language and I said, this is not the final picture. This is something we call a warm-up. And what you're making with the tracing paper is a warm-up. And so when she saw that she was still going to be able to do the things she's doing. So I'm not going to say we're not riding a bike when we are, but I might say, well, no, we're riding this. I might even find another thing that we do ride.
To the steps of riding. You're right.
Right, or we're going to ride a cart or whatever it is that's really stable. And I say we're not doing bike riding. So I might give them another thing so that they could start to do it without engaging them in a giant conversation about what they will or will not do and try and lower their anxiety.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said earlier about, is what's a reasonable expectation that we can work towards.
And I certainly wouldn't call it bike riding at that point.
All right, Leslie, thank you so much. Again, tons of questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today. There are, we are going to look to get those questions answered for all of you and get them out to you afterwards. Before we go, any final statements that you want to make to our audience today?
Yes, well, I don't want to forget to thank you.
Okay.
And it's been wonderful having you and having this conversation with you. You obviously have some very good repertoires. I want to thank Autism Ontario. I want to thank the anonymous donor and the Cheyenne Kaushal Charitable Foundation. I want to thank Mark Spolstra, even though I hear she doesn't want to be thanked, but thank you. And then I guess what I want to say is, what's the main message here? I think the main message of behavior analysis is we want to continue to have hope, and we feel the tremendous potential in all human beings and in your kids and in you. And so we're saying, let's get moving, let's take some action together. But we have techniques that can help us on our journey, and so that's the main message.
And I think everyone got that from your presentation today. That concludes our session. We're sorry we went just a little bit long. A reminder, this session will be recorded, archived, and hosted on Autism Ontario's website in the coming days. So if you want to watch it again, or if you feel there's someone who might gain some value from it, you can point them in that direction. And that's where all of our webinars from the past programs have been housed. Also, this is just a starting point for Everyday ABA. Starting in September, Leslie will be in Sudbury, followed by London, Ottawa, and Markham for more in-depth in-person sessions. And once again, you can go back to the Autism Ontario website to get that information. On behalf of Leslie, Autism Ontario, we thank you for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Autism Ontario event.
Thank you so much.